4057. Look over there.
No, you can look in the book, and that's
All right. Are there questions for this week?
yeah.
Can you send me the Google Doc? Can you make this go a little bit higher so I can just see the bottom of these phones? Yeah, higher. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Oh, there you go. Did you send the doc? Let's get it going. I'm gonna start. When I do that, why don't you send it to me? Okay. Ready?
Yeah, we're good to go.
What is this, number 27? All right. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Had a little bit of technical difficulties getting started today, but welcome to Maximus Call-In Radio Show number 27. It's unbelievable how many episodes we've done at this point, but it's great to have everyone. We are streaming live on Discord, so thanks, Jared and Michael, for joining us. We have some folks on Instagram. I see I got a Doc Marana over there, Adam, and Diego's joining us on TikTok. Welcome to all our listeners on Twitter Spaces. I see John and Khair, and we are going on Clubhouse as well, if it can maintain the stream over there. So yeah, whatever channel you're on, and YouTube Live, last but not least. Thank you for everyone who's joining us. So for those of you who are new, this is a call-in radio show format. I'm a clinical psychologist and psychiatry professor by training, and I have a specialty in essentially mind-body health and especially masculine health. So I work with top CEOs and VCs, most of whom are men, in terms of optimizing their health and well-being. So if you have any questions related to optimizing your mindset, your physical body, fitness, nutrition, sleep, testosterone, happy to answer any and all questions. So we usually kick off the show with what we call our weekly unpopular opinion. I like to share lots of unpopular opinions on Twitter. And this week's unpopular opinion has to do with the emergence of health trackers. So there's a million health trackers, sleep trackers that are out there, some of whom are gaining a lot of popularity. And while I'm obviously a huge health tech enthusiast, being a CEO of a health tech company, I'm actually relatively skeptical of a lot of the wearables and trackers that are out there for non-clinical purposes. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of these, they're essentially diagnostics that are designed for the consumer, are actually very helpful if you have a clinical condition. So let's talk about some examples of that. If you have diabetes, I think the use of a continuous glucose monitor is actually pretty helpful because essentially your blood sugar is out of control and you get a pretty useful real time feedback in terms of what foods spike your blood sugar levels. Now, if you're perfectly normally healthy, maybe even pre diabetic, I sort of question the utility of it because, first of all, you're not going to get sort of abnormal blood spikes from eating normal things. You can essentially, without the device, essentially predict what's going to give you a glucose spike from just looking at the glycemic index of that thing. So, for instance, pretty much universally, if you are eating meat or any sort of animal based food that is high in protein and fat and does not have carbohydrates, you will by definition not have any glucose spike at all. That's essentially why it's sort of the foundation of any sort of universal human diet. So you don't need some crazy CGM to tell you that donuts spike your blood sugar when you should just be eating stuff that doesn't spike it in the first place, and we know doesn't spike it in the first place. Now, from maybe a fine tuning perspective, you want to know exactly how much apple that you eat spikes your blood sugar. Sure, go nuts. But I don't really think it's a necessary and useful thing for most people. However, if you're obviously diabetic, especially type 1 diabetic, and having too much or too little carbohydrate or insulin is going to mean having a going hyperglycemic in terms of excessive blood sugar or going hypoglycemic because you didn't have enough insulin, then yeah, it's kind of a useful technology. How about some other examples? The most common usage of meditation apps like Calm and Headspace is actually not to learn meditation. As I argue, it's actually for people who have mild insomnia and they want to go to sleep. That's why Calm has sort of like pushed sleep stories and Headspace has kind of followed suit. So if you're having trouble falling asleep, then yes, it can be quite useful to listen to something soothing that prevents you from ruminating too much and helps you improve your sleep latency. Otherwise, does it make a huge difference? Questionable benefits. I do think there are some particular benefits to a regular mindfulness sort of practice. If you're doing it sort of consistently, there's some research to support that, but it's not an absolute sort of necessity. Same thing for sleep tracking, I would say. If you don't have any sleep problems, the utility of sleep tracking is, I would actually argue, sort of questionable. Like, do you really need to know the difference between your light and deep and REM sleep in that nuance of a perspective? Not really. What you really should be tracking is just how early are you going to bed and how much are you sleeping, which you can do with a pencil and paper, or just basically you're paying attention to what time you're falling asleep and waking up. You don't need a complex sleep tracker to do that. So that's just kind of my opinion. People ask me all the time about what are the right wearables, tracking technology, etc. My philosophy as a behavioral psychologist is you track only insofar as you're making an active intervention to change that thing, right? Passive sort of data collection, especially that's like overly detailed and nuanced, really doesn't help people for the most part. But if you're doing something very concrete, so let's say you actually are excessively using social media and you're wasting an incredible amount of time, then it can be actually quite useful for you to look at your screen time on, and your Apple iPhone actually has that as a feature now. If you go into the settings and you look at the screen time, it'll tell you not only how many hours and minutes a day you're using your phone, it'll tell you how many times you picked it up, which apps are particularly problematic that you tend to be overusing. And then you can use that and say, look, I'd like a 50% reduction in my social media use. I'm going to implement dopamine fasting, for instance. I'm not going to just use it whenever I feel like it. I'm only going to do it at regularly scheduled times and try to take 1 to 4 hours off at the end of every day where I'm not touching my phone. I'm putting it away. And let's see if that 50% goes down. In that case, it would be very useful to track. But the thing is, you want to be doing that while you're making that active intervention. You're trying to get down to 50%. Let's say you cut it in half. You've been good for a long while. Let's say you've been doing it for weeks. Do you need to track after that? Not really. If you're sort of in maintenance phase, you're stable, you're not having a lot of relapses, you don't need to track on an ongoing basis. So my philosophy is track only insofar as you're making active weekly iterations to changing that behavior. Once that behavior is stable and in place, then you don't necessarily need to track all the time. It can be helpful, I would say, with certain things that are relatively passive to sort of track if it doesn't take a lot of effort on your part. So an example of this is stepping on a scale every day. I actually think most people should step on a scale every day. And the reason for that is, once you've sort of lost weight or you're at your goal weight, it'll obviously tell you if you're creeping back up in weight, and you need to, regulate and tighten your diet a little bit. So there is good research that shows that daily weighing not only helps people lose weight, but it helps them keep it off. And obviously, unfortunately, adults in America put on about 1 to 2 pounds, or about 1% of their body weight per year as an adult. Doesn't seem like a lot, but obviously, if you do the math over 10 to 20 years, you've now put on an extra 10 to 20 pounds, and maybe even 20 to 40 pounds if you're on the upper end of that range. And obviously, you've become overweight or obese. The thing is, you don't notice that because 1 to 2 pounds over a year is not even visually distinguishable, but it compounds that interest over time. And obviously, a weight scale can tell you, oh, I weigh 4 more pounds than I did 2 years ago. Maybe I want to stay around sort of my goal weight. So, anyway, that's my point of view about sort of health tracking and technology. It's very useful to tell if an intervention is working, but if you're not actively intervening, changing, working on it, working with a therapist, working with a coach, working with a squad like you are in Maximus, where we're daily to weekly checking in, making tweaks, then I wouldn't say don't go nuts with sort of the health tracking. So use it when it's useful, but you don't need to go crazy. And I don't think everyone needs to track everything at all times. I think the problem is there's too much information for us to process. It creates cognitive overload. And I also think there's too much of an emphasis on diagnostics. All of these are just diagnostics. And the one thing I tell everyone is data does not change behavior. Uh, Most people don't need a CGM to tell them that a donut spikes your blood sugar and is bad for you. Most people know a donut's bad for you, and you don't need some magical data point to tell you that. So, I don't think, unfortunately, change behavior. The reason people eat donuts is because it's pleasurable and it numbs negative feelings. And there's no amount of data or there's no graph that's going to change the deeper psychological, emotional reason that people engage in problematic behavior. It's almost like a very naive technologist point of view that if you just explain to people why it's harmful to them, they'll correct their behavior. And any psychologist who's worked with any patient knows that it's not about sort of the conscious knowledge. There's a lot more that's happening on a subconscious and unconscious and emotional level that drives behavior. And it's not so simple as just telling people to stop it. So all right, so that's this week's unpopular opinion. Let's take questions from the audience. If you want to call in and ask a question, just unmute yourself on Discord, or if you're on Twitter Spaces, feel free to chime in and ask a question. If not, it looks like we got a couple questions coming in from Instagram that I'll take.
Hey, Dr. Cam, I have a question.
Yes, sir. How's it going, Jared?
Good. Listen, I was wondering, do you have any actionable advice for finding or creating your purpose in life? And would a program like Jordan Peterson's future authoring be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Jordan's work, and I haven't like gone through the future authoring program myself or looked at the materials, but I know that's sort of one of the purposes or intentions of that program is to obviously kind of think about who you want to be, and I think that's actually the way that I sort of describe it is a lot of young people feel very lost because it's a very onerous question of like, what do I want to do with my life? Right. And that's very contextual in the sense of, well, it depends on what duties and obligations do you have. Like, for instance, do you have a ton of student debt? That's going to limit, quite frankly, what you can do with your life, at least in the immediate future, in terms of paying off your debt. Do you have obligations to your family? Are you able to move? Are you not able to move? What's your risk tolerance? All of these things are going to determine what you do, especially I would say in the short term. I think a more useful question is I always encourage people to think about who do you want to be? And that is less contextual. That's really a little bit more about your values or what's really important to you in life. And so that's kind of my orientation. I use and teach a type of psychotherapy called ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. It's a values based therapy. And one of the things, one of the 6 processes that are encompassed in ACT is values clarification. And so, one of the things that I encourage you to do actually is just to sit down, whether you can do it whether in a future authoring program or you can just do it with a pencil and paper and write down what are the values that are important to you? And values are very distinct from goals. The difference between a goal might be like, I want to make X amount of money, I want to get married, I want to buy a house, I want to get a degree. These are concrete, achievable things. You can look at them on your to do list and say, I did it or I didn't do it. The problem is they're also very long, temporally long away, right? It may take you years to achieve some of those goals. Doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing, but it can be very frustrating if you feel like, oh, I'm like a decade away from finding my dream house or my dream partner, my dream job, all of these things. What do I do in the here and now? The nice thing about values is that they're by definition inachievable, right? So as opposed to finding a wife, the value might be, I want to be a loving person, I want to be a loving partner. And so you can do that en route to finding that partner, right? Like you could create a dating app profile that expresses the fact that you're looking for a meaningful relationship, right? And you can, and that is an act of being loving, right? Or even going on a first date, you can be kind and empathic to that person, even though they're not your wife, but you're evaluating them as being wife material. And so you're still pursuing that value. And even if you decide to get into a relationship, and let's say you get your girlfriend flowers on Valentine's Day, you're not like, oh, I'm done with the loving. It's I've checked it off my list. No more is necessary. It's a continual thing. You're literally never done loving or being a loving partner. And that's why values are, by definition, inachievable. The nice thing about being inachievable is that means you can do it in any given moment. Literally, right now, as you're listening to this show, you could be expressing that value of yeah, being loving. Now, so that's the first thing I would do is I would write down maybe 5 to 10 values that are important to you. Now, I would say common value domains that are almost universal to everyone. Usually, someone has a value around their health, some expression of what that is usually some value around your career or your profession. There's usually some value around family and or potentially parenting, depending on what phase of life that you're in. There's sometimes a value around community if that's important to you. There may be a value around spirituality or religion if that's important to you. That may or may not apply. And there may be some value around fun, artistic appreciation, creativity as well. I would say those are almost like the most common value domains. So, what I would encourage you for each of those domains is rank and prioritize them, right? So, literally from 1 to 5, 1 to 10, which of those domains are most important to you. So, for instance, you might decide, okay, health is number one because it's the foundation to all of the other things. Number two is family. Number three is career, etc. And then what I want you to do is to actually write a personal and vivid statement of what that value is to you. And that's going to be individualistic to you, right? So while I would say most people obviously want to, be healthy, you might want to write a very specific value that expresses your own philosophy or view on it. So for instance, like one of my professional values when it comes to career is, the reason I hope I became a psychologist is I really have a value around alleviating human suffering and enabling people to be the best they can be, right? So that's sort of my value. And everything that I do, because literally have 3 jobs, right? I have a private practice where I coach CEOs. I enable them to be the best that they can be. I am a clinical professor and I train psychiatrists. I enable them to be the best doctors that they can be. And then through Maximus, and obviously through this radio show and all the patients that we serve through our telemedicine platform, hopefully we can help millions of people be the best that they can be. But it's all oriented around that one value, right? And whether or not I did it in, a teaching context, a private practice context, a corporate context, I can express that value in multiple different ways. And that's the beautiful thing about values is that they're flexible, right? And even if one of those jobs came to an end, 2 of those jobs, even 3 of those jobs, I could always find a way to help alleviate suffering and help people. Maybe it's just volunteering as a big brother. I'm expressing that value. And so that's the nice thing is you don't have to, get the dream house, dream girl, dream job, etc., to feel like you're fulfilled in life. The question is when you get up every single day, are you making progress towards or away from your values? And so you can in after 12 hours, 16 hours you went through this Thursday, you can look back upon it and say, did I make some effort? Did I make at least one small step? Did I make a little bit of incremental progress towards those values? And if I did, I should feel proud of myself because I'm doing the things that I said are important to me in life, right? And you may want to evaluate too. sorry, the mic is off on Twitter. Thank you for letting me know that. You may want to also evaluate if the prioritization that you're saying is reflective of how you're living your daily life. So, for instance, if I said, health and family are number one and number two, but career is number three, but I'm spending all of my time working, I'm not sleeping, I'm not taking care of my health, I did not call my mom and dad even for 5, 15 minutes today, then there's something incongruent between what I'm saying and what I'm doing, right? And that sort of disconnect causes dissonance. And so you can reevaluate and be like, oh, okay, I'm not quite prioritizing the way that I want. What do I want to do differently tomorrow? Right. And so that's where you're taking it from this theoretical, what are my values to how am I actually living those values on a day to day basis. So that's kind of the framework that we use in ACT. Is I think it's very important to explore your values, understand your values, clarify them, have literally a statement that reflects every single one of your values, know how they're prioritized. And when you do this exercise, by the way, you can kind of tell whether a value is sort of genuine is when it elicits something genuine in you, like you feel an emotional response. Like when I talk about alleviating human suffering and enabling people to be the best that they can be, it gets me jazzed up, right? Because I think about the first company that I started. We helped 500,000 people lose 5 million pounds. And I know how life transformative that is for someone to avoid diabetes and heart disease because I've worked with people who've literally had an amputation, had their leg chopped off, and how terrible it is in terms of their quality of life to do that. And if I can spare someone of that pain, I feel like I have purpose, right? There's meaning in my life. So when I talk about it, and hopefully that's conveyed when you hear it too, is that's a deep sort of purpose, and it gives me the motivation to go through my own pain and suffering in terms of what you have to do that, because obviously the amount of education or the amount of effort that you have to put into doing this work is quite tremendous. But to me, it's all worthwhile because it serves that underlying value or purpose. So when you're writing your values, you should feel a little bit of an emotional resonance too, where you feel a connection to that value. It resonates, it's, like a fire in your belly. That's the way that I would put it. That's what it should sort of elicit. And you want to check in on, like I said, you want to reflect on those values every once in a while and be like, yeah, this is my compass. This is sort of my North Star. This is where I'm heading. This is where I'm heading in terms of who I want to be. And when you know who you want to be, it'll help determine what you want to do, right? Because if I know, like, my value, for instance, is to alleviate human suffering and enable people to be the best that they can be, then the next question is, okay, what are the things that I can do that I can express that on a daily basis? What's the best way of living that out given the limited circumstances that I have at the time? And that may evolve over time, right? Like when I was just starting out, I was like, maybe working with patients one on one, that's the only way I can do that, and maybe volunteering. Now that I have financial resources, economic, or human resources at my disposal, I can start companies, I can hire people, I can get a lot of people to help do that. But that came with a decade of time, right? And so that's the thing too, is your goals come out of your values, and the more that you sort of work towards them on a day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year basis, the expression of those values will become more and more complex as your goals become essentially more and more ambitious, and you'll have more and more resources in order to achieve them. So, is that a helpful sort of framework, Jared, in terms of thinking about finding sort of your purpose in life?
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to get to because I remember you mentioning about your outlook on values versus goals. So thanks for elaborating on that.
Yeah. By the way, I'm just kind of curious, just to give me a little bit of context. Like, why is this coming up for you in your life right now? Is there something that's sort of prompting this search?
Well, the goal that I did have and was working a couple years to try and achieve has not worked out. So I guess I'm trying to reevaluate where I'm going.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, when you have sort of a blockage and something's got in the way of where you were heading, it makes sense to like pause, take a look around, and reevaluate. Are you willing to talk a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, yeah. I was trying to become a police officer in Ontario
Hmm.
and, working through getting physically in shape and becoming a good candidate for the police services. And then they essentially change the way their vision standards work
Mm-hmm.
and how they do their vision testing,
Yeah.
and I immediately just was disqualified
Oh,
from the entire process. So my eyes are not capable of laser surgery or any kind of improvement. They're just too bad, and that's just the way it is.
yeah. I feel your pain. In fact, the first job that I got, I was doing biomedical research, and ironically, my boss really wanted to be a Navy fighter pilot, and had a very similar experience to you, where that was his dream. Like he was an ROTC, he was like prepared his whole life for this goal of being a Navy fighter pilot, and they gave him a medical disqualification due to vision, and he couldn't do it, and he obviously took a pivot and took a whole different pursuit in his life. He ended up becoming a researcher, and then he actually went back to school, became a surgical PA, and now he actually helps assist people with surgeries. And I think he sort of found his new sort of purpose in life. You obviously you had a blockage in terms of your goals, right? Like you're obviously unfortunately not able to become a police officer, and I'm deeply sorry that it's a sort of an unfortunate circumstance that blocked you from doing it. But let me ask you a question. So that's the goal. What was the value behind that goal? Like why was it important for you to become a police officer out of all the other jobs in the world that you could have pursued?
I thought of this when you were talking. I really liked the idea of being able to stop people from doing bad things to other people, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose, um, and stop evil people from committing evil acts.
Yep.
That was what really fired me up when you said that. It got inside to make me remember why I wanted to do it.
Yep, that makes sense. And so let's dig a little deeper there. So want to stop bad people from doing bad things. Makes a lot of sense. What's the value behind that? Like, why is that important to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Is there an underlying something that's important to you around I don't know, justice, fairness? Would you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Bringing people to justice or bringing evil people to justice. Um, yeah, I guess making sure they get their comeuppance, even though that sounds vengeful, but
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a little bit of like negative, not negativity, but one thing that's useful to clarify is values can't be negative in terms of the absence of something, right? So, for instance, if someone not related to what you're saying, but let's say hypothetically, someone was like, I don't want to feel anxious," I would say that's not a value. That's what we joke is a dead man value. A dead man's not anxious, and so it's better than you at achieving that. So that's not really a value. The question is, well, if you weren't anxious, then what would that enable you to do? Right. So I guess I'm going to kind of use that analogy for your question, which is like, let's suppose, there were less bad people in the world, or they were more encumbered from doing bad things. What would that enable? What positive benefits would that give to people or society?
well, it would hopefully stop people from getting hurt.
Hmm.
You know.
And that would provide what? Safety, security,
Hmm. Yeah.
protection, peace of mind.
Hmm. Yeah.
So you see what I'm doing? I'm sort of like being like, okay, well, let's forget the absence of something or the lack of something, which is evil and bad behavior. But what is that? What's the converse of that? Right? Like if you thought about your ideal world, like what would be the adjectives that you'd use to describe it, right? In Ontario. Like what would you want your community to be if it was almost like a utopia?
God. I don't know. Is that even possible?
I just this is a hypothetical thought exercise. So let your realisticness aside be aside for a second.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard for me not to focus on the, the negative aspects and just getting rid of all the problems.
Hmm.
Like naturally being a problem solver, I would try and solve the homeless problem, the drug problem,
Hmm.
the epidemic of depression and mental illness.
Okay, and that would enable what?
I guess people would be generally happy.
Yeah, I guess helping people be better, thrive, etc. So I think you are tapping into, you're starting to get in transition, I would say, from goals to values, right? So like the goal is like, I wanted to be a police officer. Unfortunately, I'm blocked from being a police officer. Now, where do I go? Right? Makes total sense. And by the way, this is a perfect illustration of the dangers of living a goal-oriented life. I know it sounds crazy because everyone's like, "Oh, it's great to be goal-oriented." I make the complete contrarian, opposite point of view. I actually think you should not be goal-oriented in life, not as your primary orientation, right? Because you're going to run into the same exact problem that you so unfortunately and beautifully illustrate, which is if that's your north star is one goal, that and for some random unfortunate reason it gets blocked, then where do you find yourself, right? You found yourself exactly where you are, which is like lost essentially. um, and so rather than that, what may be useful is to be very, very clear. And I would encourage you actually to do this as a writing exercise, right? Is to think about, you know, what are the values that underlie it in kind of our preliminary exploration. I would do obviously a lot more exploration if I was working with you as a client, but I think this is a useful illustrative example. It sounds like you really do have some values around justice and fairness, right? Because those to me are like the emblematic values of, like being a police officer, safety officer, right? So you can think about like, okay, if those are your values, like I want a more just society, there are many ways you can express that, whether personally or professionally, right? So like a lot of people obviously just volunteer. There's like neighborhood watch, for instance. Maybe you're not a police officer, but you can do neighborhood watch and you could protect your community, actually, right? So you can still find a way to live that value and bring personal satisfaction to yourself, even if it's not your primary profession, right? So that's an example of that. Second parts of it where you sounded like there was a little bit even more than just like justice, temperance, and fairness. You specifically mentioned the homelessness problem, the drug problem, the mental health problem. So it sounds like there's a little bit around just kind of like what I was saying too, that you do have a value around suffering, right? Like obviously not all homeless people or mentally ill people are all bad people, right? So it's not the only thing you don't, it sounds like you care about is not just like evildoers, right? But there's people who are genuinely suffering. And obviously, police don't just encounter criminals, they are kind of community stewards, right? Unfortunately, they do interact with a lot of folks who are mentally ill and on the street and try to help them, provide them with resources, et cetera, make sure they're safe, getting their needs attended to, getting them into homeless shelters, et cetera. And so, if that's a value, which is around sort of alleviating, suffering or helping, let's say, the unfortunate or the marginalized people of society, there's lots of ways you can do that, right? You can obviously go into the whole mental health field. You can go into nonprofit work. You can, work for the government in the Department of Health, Health and Human Services. You can do social work. Um, there's lots of things that you can do that would be an outgrowth or a pursuit of that value, right? And similarly, you can also just volunteer. Like you can go to homeless shelter once a week, feed the homeless, and that can also be very satisfying. So that's the beauty, I think, and creativity of values is, if you know what your values are, there's a million different ways of expressing that. And that can be personally, it can be professionally, it can be full-time, it can be volunteer. And then you just have to make a determination of how important that value is in relation to your other values, right? So let's say your values may be like my health and my family. In order for me to provide for my family as a male, I have to have a decent paying job given the city that I live in. I don't know how expensive Ontario is, but LA is very expensive. And so you're like, okay, maybe nonprofit work is not the best thing. It serves that value in terms of helping people and alleviating suffering, but it doesn't allow me to like feed a family and buy a house in LA. So given that, how do I make sure that I have a profession that provides for me and my family first and foremost before I go help the community, right? Or is there a higher paying way of serving it, right? So I may become a psychiatrist, for instance. You can make $250,000 a year to even doing community work as a community psychiatrist because there's such a high demand for them, where you're helping people, still getting paid decent amount, providing for your family, and so you're balancing that. And so these are the practical kind of balancing concerns that you come from prioritizing your values. Is I don't believe in being like super lofty and idealistic. Yeah, you got to be very practical about your concerns. You got to make money. You got to provide for yourself and your family, but when you know what your values are, the goals and how you sort of balance them become a lot clearer.
I don't want to take up too much of everyone else's time, but how do I make sure that I'm getting the correct values? Because essentially you just turned it around, and we explored the value that I said,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a little more negative, and then you kind of went deeper. So how do I make sure I'm doing that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that there's no like right or wrong values. They're idiosyncratic to you. Obviously, if as long as they're not like harming anyone else, and they're genuine and authentic to you, they're going to be your values. Like your values are going to be different from my values and probably every other person that's listening, right? There may be some similarities, but they're idiosyncratic to you. But I would just say, yeah, as long as they follow the rules of thumbs of what a value are, then you know it's right. So one of them I already talked about, right? It should be inachievable, right? So it can't be something that you can accomplish or don't accomplish. Then you need to frame it as something inachievable, right? Like being a loving partner versus celebrating an anniversary or having a partner, right? So make sure it's that. Make sure it's something that is you can essentially practice at any given time, right? On almost like an everyday basis, you can live that value, even if it's in a very subtle way. That's how you know it's a value. Third, it should be intrinsic. So here's a useful heuristic: is if nobody else could see you doing that value, would you still do it? Right? Obviously, if it is, then you know it's intrinsic. Like it comes from deep within you. It's not because of extrinsic reinforcement or reward or pride or other people like seeing you as a great police officer. You would do it even if no one was looking, right? So and then fourth, as I said, it shouldn't be a dead man value. It can't be like I'm doing something in order to eliminate, or it's because of the absence of something. It's if you flip flop that and be like, okay, what would that achieve, right? Peace, prosperity, wellness, security, safety, etc. Then I think it's positively framed. And then fifth, like I said, it should evoke an emotional response, right? It should get you fired up. It should give you a little bit of sense of motivation, right? And I in ACT we talk about how the motivation that comes from values is literally the fuel to the fire that makes you willing to step in the face of pain and suffering. Because I think ACT is very aligned with Buddhist philosophy in the sense that like life is suffering, right? Like even if you had decided to pursue being a police officer, you would have encountered a ton of suffering. You got to go through all this training. You're taking on obviously risk. If you have a family, they have to suffer too, knowing that you could be hurt in the line of duty. You may see colleagues or friends hurt and suffer in terms of their loss. And then obviously you're going to see a ton of the people that you work with in the community who are literally suffering from being homeless, mentally ill, drug addicted, going to jail. And so your entire profession is around suffering, both personally, vicariously, and all the loved ones around you. So what makes it worthwhile to literally do that? It has to be a deeply motivating value that makes the encountering of that, the approach of that worthwhile. And so that's why I do think the sort of emotional resonance is really important, because that's literally what gets you up and gets you out of bed every single morning. And so it's useful to every once in a while remember that, right? Like I wrote my values when I was 22. I talked about this in a previous podcast. They're not that different than many years later. They're still on my bedroom wall at my parents' home in San Diego. I go back and look on them and I'm like, that's still what I want my life to be about. Now the vision has changed a little bit. The goals have changed in terms of how I express that. I never thought I'd be running a company when I was 22. But the company to me is not important. The company to me is just an outgrowth. It's the expression of that value. And even if VC funding dried up and Silicon Valley disappeared, I'd find another way of expressing that. So that's why it's a very flexible way of living. And to me, I talk about this all the time. The clients or patients that I work with, I'm not worried if they're depressed. I'm not worried if they're anxious. That is part of the suffering of life. What I'm worried about is people who are overly rigid. It's psychological inflexibility that leads to real suffering, right? And you're like, if you said, my only purpose in life, my only goal in life is to be a police officer, and now that I can't be a police officer, my life is worthless and meaningless, and I can't imagine doing anything else. life is ruined, then yes, of course you're going to suffer, but that suffering is coming from your own interpretation of this rigid rule that's quite frankly made up. And but because you believe it, right? Because you buy into it, because you're fused with it, then you're creating, instead of the just the clean pain of rejection of being a police officer, now you have all the suffering and saying my life is worthless and meaningless because you've determined it to be so, right? And so that's an example of psychological inflexibility or rigidity. What we're trying to do with sort of ACT philosophy, and what I'm trying to obviously do in the work that we do at Maximus, is encouraging psychological flexibility. And when you use values instead of goals as your orientation in life, it's inherently flexible because there's a million ways, like I said, in any given moment, in a multitude of different ways, you can live out that value, and you can find a way. And so your life will always have purpose. Your life will always have meaning, literally on a today. You don't need to find your new profession, even if you know what your values are. So like even like in the example that I said is like, I want to provide, safety and security, and I want to promote people's well-being. Like if that's your value, you can do that in a little way every day. When I was a Boy Scout, we'd like help people cross the street. You could hold a door open for someone. And so, the way that we do that, we had a little coin and you had to do a good deed every day, right? And so you literally put the coin in your left pocket, and by the end of the day, you had to do a good deed, transfer it to your right pocket. And it became this little behavioral trick, right? And that's how, and I'd find the littlest thing, like I said, holding a door open, saying a nice thing to the grocer, whatever it is, paying someone a compliment was an expression of kindness, as an expression of service, an expression of gratitude, etc. And so it could be a small thing, could be a big thing. We obviously did bigger projects where we clean trails and clean up the beaches and do all kinds of community work. But it could be a small thing, and you can literally do it and start today. And so by the time you go to sleep tonight, you can be like, hey, I made a little dent in the universe. I made some progress towards living that value. And then I'll go on to do, grander and bigger expressions of that. But you don't need to wait to feel like you have purpose in your life. You can literally start today. And so that's my message. And I hope you take it to heart.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And feel free to check in the future if you want to continue to obviously refine your values and give us an update in terms of how you are living them. I always love getting updates from people.
Will do.
All right. Other folks, other questions?
We had a question.
Hi, Dr. Cam.
Hey there.
Hello. So I kind of wanted to continue just a question that I had from last week.
Yes,
about,
sir.
About oxytocin.
Uh-huh.
I know I have like kind of just a laser like focus on this. Does Maximus Tribe currently have like anything in development in terms of like a troche? And if so, are there any positions open where one might be able to contribute to the development of such a, or might be able to contribute to more effectively developing such a product?
Yeah. I mean, I won't talk about it too much, but we have some pretty exciting research and development in the works that's along those lines. So yes, I'm very excited about that. Um, and so yes, obviously it's something that I'm interested in, and I don't sort of promote anything that doesn't have a lot of research behind it. And I think there's some very exciting research on the benefits of a lot of different hormones, oxytocin being sort of one of them. So yes, yeah. So that's in development. We're doing some internal testing, getting some pretty good results, I would say. So yes, in the works to be revealed and discussed at a later time. But yeah, I mean, in terms of helping us out, yeah, we are hiring. If you go on our AngelList website, we have a bunch of open jobs. The most pertinent of which are, we're hiring a senior software engineer, we're hiring a product manager. Let's see what else we have. We're hiring a kind of a customer success representative that directly interfaces with our patients. So actually, speaking of service, if you want to work closely with patients in terms of enhancing their well-being, we are hiring for that position. And then we kind of have two background positions we're not actively hiring for in terms of operations and marketing, but if we find the right person, we may be open to that. And then last, we're kind of potentially hiring a social media intern to help us make a meme account. But that's kind of a fun special project, I would say.
That's it.
What's your background and interest?
I actually do have a degree in biomedical engineering, so I was thinking just maybe of using that background to like maybe trying to maybe like sort through medical literature or maybe talk to a patient who's receiving a certain form of treatment and kind of like maybe compile something that could be of use to either whatever scientists are developing it or to whoever might want to take the product onto themselves and see how it works for them.
I know we do work with like some MDs and PhDs and people who have science degrees to do scientific writing. So
I don't have an MD.
uh, yeah, I'm
PhD.
just saying like as illustratively, some of the writers that we work with don't are not MDs or PhDs, but they have at least like a bachelor's or master's in some scientific field. Obviously, if you can just write a scientific research paper, that's probably enough. I mean, that's the most pertinent thing that comes to mind. If you ever interested in like, for instance, if you wanted to write an article on the latest scientific research on oxytocin and the potential benefits of it, like that's something I could definitely like work with you on. I'd be interested in actually doing that. Then that's something that can be done part-time remote on a contract basis. Obviously, as we grow, we work with a couple writers right now that are doing stuff like that. So that's the most immediate thing that comes to mind. If you have anything more specific, you can just email me or just DM me on Discord and we can talk.
Okay. Right.
Sounds good.
We had a comment on YouTube on the last topic. Jonathan said, "Yeah, I was actually struggling with this for years. I finally took the time to find my passion and align it with my values. I'm 42, so having a career change at this point was a little intimidating."
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Jonathan. I used to work at like three VA hospitals, as I've said, and mostly with guys who are over the age of 65, right? So these are retired, oftentimes like Vietnam era veterans. And I always say you can definitely teach an old dog new tricks. It just takes a little bit more time. So it's never too late in terms of living your values. Now, by the way, that point though is very valid, right? If you, in terms of making a career change, it can be intimidating, and it may actually be difficult, if not it may not be worth the ROI. Like I would say, like for instance, someone it depends on your family situation. Like someone going back in their 40s or 50s and going through med school residency in order to become a doctor, for most people I would argue it's not really worth it because there's an incredible amount of sacrifice that is required, and it's easier to do when you're single, quite frankly, right? When you're doing it when you're 20s and most of the folks, at least when they start out, are not married and don't have kids. It's easier to do. Not to say that it's not doable. There's lots of people, obviously, either towards the end of the training or there are people who come back and do that later in life. But there is a lot of sacrifice that's involved in doing that. So hold on one second. So that's an example of a goal, right? Like going back and changing your career, switching a career may be a goal that may be impractical, right? Maybe you got a mortgage to pay. Maybe your family won't let you move in order to do your training, etc. So that's okay. But you can still find a different way of living out that value. But I'm glad in your particular case, you were able to sort of, do that. And I wish you the best in pursuing that. And if you want to talk about it sometime, feel free to call in. Speaking of hormones, we got a question from Carlos on Instagram. He says, "Hi, sir, follower from Colombia. Just about to take 6 milligrams melatonin. Just finished med school. My circadian rhythm is wasted. So melatonin to reschedule them. Opinions on melatonin." Okay, so I kind of gleaned the point of this question. This guy just finished med school. He's probably really sleep deprived. His sleep schedule's out of whack, dysregulated circadian rhythm. So he's trying to take melatonin to fix it. Okay. So first of all, I'm not going to provide medical advice, but here's what I would say that you should do in consultation with your own physician. I don't know what the medical status of melatonin is in Colombia. In the U.S., it's an over-the-counter supplement, but in certain parts of the world, it's not. In Germany, I believe it's actually a prescription drug. So first of all, I'd like figure out what the regulatory status is. It sounds like you have access to it from what you're talking about. But I've talked about this on a previous show. Melatonin, I don't recommend on a regular basis as a sleep aid. I don't think people should be taking it. It is a hormone. And so you should be taking it very carefully or purposefully. And it's sort of unclear if it's very safe. You can't really overdose too much on it unless you're taking ridiculous doses, at least on terms of normal dosages. But if you're taking very high doses of it, there's a speculation or a hypothesis that it may downregulate your endogenous production, meaning that your body's own production of it may decrease. 6 milligrams of melatonin that you're talking about is far too much, that I would say. So if you look at the research literature, first of all, your body only produces 300 micrograms or 0.3 milligrams, right? You're taking literally 20 times the dose that your body makes. That's overkill. So generally what I recommend to people is if they're trying to shift their sleep schedule back, whether because of jet lag or because they've been staying up too late studying for med school exams and now you want to go to sleep earlier, in consultation with your PCP, you can discuss taking, I believe Life Extension has 300 micrograms or 0.3 milligrams extended release. So it releases over the course of 6 hours, just like your body does. The problem is if you take an immediate release form of melatonin, it's immediately absorbed. It only lasts in the blood for, I believe, like 30 to 60 minutes ballpark. And so it'll kind of induce sort of or promote or encourage sleep, but it doesn't last and you may wake up. That's why I like the extended release version more. There's some additional research to say that doses up to about 1 milligram may be optimal. So if you're really struggling, I would say between 0.3 and 1 milligram is probably the sweet spot. Unfortunately, most melatonin on the market comes in like 3 milligram dosages, sometimes up to 6 milligrams, like you're saying. It's overkill, and I always believe in taking the minimal effective dose, the MED. You want to take the least amount of any medication, particularly sleep medication, that works, because otherwise, you're going to run into greater and greater side effects, or like I said, you may be down regulating your endogenous production. Or you may develop a tolerance, right? I'm guessing with the 6 milligram, maybe you were starting out to taking 3, you didn't find it was effective, and now you're doubling the dose in order to make it work. You obviously don't want to continue doing that, right? Because once you start taking higher and higher dosages, like I said, higher and higher risk of side effects. So I would encourage you in consultation with your PCP, if you can find an extended release form, it's going to work better because it'll kind of be in your bloodstream all throughout the night. I recommend 0.3 milligrams to 1 milligram. That seems to be the most effective dose in studies. You want to do that as long as you're working on shifting your sleep schedule back to a normal time. Once you've got it back, so let's say you've been going to bed at 1 every night because of med school, you're trying to get it back to 10. First of all, that I would say, don't shift it back more than 15 to 30 minutes at a time. So meaning if you were going to start tonight, go to bed at 12:45, then 12:30, then 12:15, then 12. And so you're going to wean it back little by little over the course of, that would be, 4 times 3, 12 days, right? To go from 1 a.m. to 10 p.m. You can use the melatonin in consultation with your PCP as an adjunctive aid to help you go to sleep earlier. And then once you're there and you're stably going to bed at 10 o'clock, what happens is the body's conditioning takes over. And if you have a bedtime routine, you start getting ready for bed at 9:45, you go to bed at 10 every night, it only takes you 15 minutes to fall asleep. You don't really need melatonin anymore. And I would encourage you, obviously in consultation with your prescribing provider, to wean off of it so that you're not dependent on it. There are some medications that's totally fine and supplements that you should take every single day. The sleep stuff in particular, though, I'm just a little bit more conservative about, in that I don't think it's a great idea to be dependent on anything for sleep, because it's just very sensitive, I would say. And even if you're using stuff that helps, the problem is, like, what if you're traveling, you forget to bring it with you, and now you can't sleep because you've become dependent on that thing? Not sort of a great situation. So sleep, I would just say, is a little bit careful about, especially when it comes to the prescription stuff. Most of the prescription medications for sleep, especially in the US, they even tell you on the bottle, like, you're not supposed to take this for more than 2 weeks because it's habit forming, and it causes problems, and maybe it's even potentially carcinogenic. if you're talking about sort of the Z hypnotics like Zaloplan, Zolpidem, or what the brand names are more commonly known as Ambien. Yeah, I would just say I'm personally a little bit more conservative when it comes to sleep medications and supplements. So anyway, consult with your provider, figure that out. But remember, melatonin is a hormone, whether it's over the counter or not, and just be conservative about and careful about it, and use the minimal effective dose whenever you're using stuff like that. All right, it is 6:59. If we got, I think, got time for one last quick question if anyone wants to ask. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up for today. All right. I think it may be good time to stop then. Thank you everyone who joined us on Twitter Spaces today. It's nice to see a greater and greater crowd and that platform sort of taking off. In addition to Clubhouse, thanks everyone for joining us on Discord and YouTube Live and Twitch and Instagram. So we will be here every Thursday at 6 o'clock. You can submit your questions ahead of time. You can DM us on all our social channels or on Discord, or just call in and ask your questions. Always happy to help and be of service. Thank you.